SGA campaigns this year can spend about $14,000 on supplies, including these banners. However, for future elections, SGA recently limited that total to $7,000. Between 2002 and 2013, textbook prices rose about 82%. So this textbook, which I'm Charles Clarke, and straight ahead on WVU News, I'll tell you how coal-based power plants are opposing a new... I'm Charles Clarke. I'll tell you how a new law could prevent drug overdoses in West Virginia. I'm Charles Clarke. Coming up this week on WVU News, I'll tell you the important issues in this year's student government election. I'm Charles Clarke, and straight ahead on WVU News, I'll tell you how student government is trying to keep your cost of tuition from going up.
Charles?
Thanks, John and Nicole. 21 states and many different organizations are petitioning the Supreme Court. Justices are divided on whether the EPA should consider costs when limiting emissions. However, the EPA says the benefits are much greater. With over 40 coal-based power plants in West Virginia, I found out how these changes could affect you. The Environmental Protection Agency is being challenged in the Supreme Court on a new rule regulating the amount of mercury being produced by coal-based power plants. According to Assistant Professor Adam Berta, West Virginia is especially at risk for mercury exposure.
West Virginia as a whole tends to have a lot more coal mines, and I would say percentages are probably a little bit higher than most surrounding states who aren't as coal dependent.
Mercury exposure often comes from fish, which contain high amounts of the toxic metal. Ohio native Anthony Pappas says when he fishes in West Virginia, he is cautious about his catch.
Depends where I'm fishing at. If it's heavy waterways, such as like the Mon or the Ohio River, something like that, I wouldn't eat them.
Those opposed argue that these new rules violate a clause in the Clean Air Act, which cites that regulations must be appropriate and necessary. They claim the EPA ignored factors when passing the regulations. One of the reasons power plant companies are opposed to the rule is because of the cost. It's estimated that power plants across the country will have to spend $9.6 billion in order to comply with the new standards.
I mean, there's got to be a delicate balance. You can't just put the companies out of business, but they also have a responsibility to any waterways that they're polluting to try to clean it up as good as they can, filter it as well as they can.
If upheld, the regulations must be met by all coal-based power plants by June 2016. Justices on the Supreme Court are split on the issue, and many say they don't know how the justices are going to vote. The decision for the case is due by the end of June. John and Nicole, back to you. The Student Government Association is working with student advocates for legislative advancement. They are talking with state legislators to stop them from cutting funds that would force educators to raise the price of college. Student Body President Chris Neiden says the rising cost of tuition is hurting in-state students.
So last fall we had a 7.8% tuition increase for in-state students, and that came almost entirely as a result of the budget cut we received from the state.
West Virginia has cut $20 million over the past 2 years to the higher education budget, resulting in several tuition hikes. But economics professor John Deskins argues that tuition is only part of the problem.
Well, textbook prices are shocking. When I see what some of the students pay for textbooks, it's absolutely shocking. In my personal opinion, it's ridiculous.
And students are also bothered when these expensive textbooks end up gathering dust on shelves.
But now that I've only probably used 2 of like the 7 books that I bought, and we're, 6 weeks into the semester?
Between 2002 and 2013, textbook prices rose about 82%. So this textbook, which today costs $327, would have cost $180 back then. Despite the rising cost of both tuition and books, Professor Deskins argues that the payoff is worth it.
The difference between the lifetime earnings of people who have a college degree versus people who don't have a college degree, that difference is as high as it's ever been.
In fact, the lifetime earning difference between a bachelor's degree and a high school diploma can be as high as $600,000. Charles Clarke, WVU News, Morgantown. This year's student government elections had a record 57 candidates on the ballot, representing 3 parties for student government elections. While all the parties want to make changes, the focus of those changes are very different. Youth Party presidential candidate Spencer Wempe hopes to change the way SGA interacts with students.
Making sure that SGA is a familiar face to the student body. It's not something that you see just during election time, but something that you see regularly.
Part of the outreach towards students included efforts to make SGA more accessible. Campaign finances had been an obstacle to this in previous elections. SGA campaigns this year can spend about $14,000 on supplies, including these banners. However, for future elections, SGA recently limited that total to $7,000. While the Make a Difference movement also considered student involvement a priority, internal issues within SGA were considered a more important issue. Presidential candidate George Capel thinks there has to be a huge update within the organization.
So we want to kind of start, a true structure for SGA, because there never really has been one before, and we think in creating this structure it's really going to help us achieve our organizational goals.
Students have certainly noticed the increasing activity and efforts of SGA this week.
I think this year I've seen a lot of involvement. I've seen their posters and their campaigning everywhere, and I think it's good.
All parties hope that their efforts increase turnout, which has been between 10 and 15% in recent elections. Charles Clarke, WVU News, Morgantown.